I'm Kurt Dupre, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the 2024 Chevrolet C8 Corvette Stingray. This is our second swing at the C8 generation, the last time in a 3LT coupe, much like this one. However, that was 2 years ago, and this is a newly updated 2024 version. But prior to this week, the last new Corvette that I'd driven was around about 15 years ago. So after my time with it this week, I'm pleased to report that it is very, very fast. No surprises there. But what has actually really surprised me is how easy to live with this current C8 generation actually is. And because this Stingray is both very fast and very easy to live with, even around town at urban speeds, I'm inclined to think it's a bit of a bargain. And that's even at $195,000 as a clean skin before on-roads, or $215,000 as optioned here with 20 grand's worth of options. And even for a car that still fits push rods. That's right, push rods in a supercar in 2024. So for me at least, there's quite a bit to unpack here. So let's start at the business end at the rear. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
Famously, it took 67 years and 7 generations for the Corvette to finally mount its engine at the business end of the chassis. Not that Chevrolet hadn't thought about it for a lot longer than that. What that does do is it kind of legitimizes this as a supercar, and it also affords one other thing. It means that this version can be built from the factory in right-hand drive. So while the Corvette is currently imported by GM Special Vehicles, who do a lot of left to right-hand conversions on a lot of pickup trucks, this Corvette arrived on the boat as a right-hand drive. No remanufacturing or cutting and shutting required. So let's get in close and check out some of the details. With the engine behind the cabin, Chevrolet was forced to rethink Corvette's rather unorthodox suspension system. Now, the last Corvette that I drove was the C6 Z06 around 2009, and it handled pretty well given that the rear suspension was leaf spring. Now, it's not the dodgy ox cart stuff that's in the back of your typical Hilux, but instead it's a lateral leaf spring that was basically connected to the two wheel carriers. Now there's a big lump of engine between the two wheels, the Corvette fits an all aluminium structure with double wishbones and coil springs, just like a proper supercar. The lump in question is 6.2 litres of naturally aspirated V8 Fury with a single camshaft and push rods, which is hardly exotic supercar stuff. But GM's LS family of engines, with which this LT2 was derived, has a deep, rich well of pedigree. This LT2 outputs 369 kilowatts and 637 newton meters. That's just shy of 500 horsepower, and not too bad given that there's no forced induction or electrification. Paired with an 8-speed dual clutch transaxle, a limited slip rear diff and traction control, it's said that the Stingray will sprint to 60 mile an hour from a standstill in just 2.9 seconds. So let's call it 3 seconds flat for the sprint from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour. So right off the bat, a sub $200,000 ask for a 3-second mid-engine supercar starts to look like a pretty handsome deal. And that's for this higher grade 3LT version. Now there is a 2LT version that does remove some fancy stuff in the cabin, and that will save you around 15 grand. What you probably don't want to know is that this car is a clean skin, costs only 82 grand in the US. However, in Australia, we get a fairly high specification, including the tasty Z51 Performance Pack. It gets a lot of go fast addenda. The Z51 addenda includes upgraded Brembo brakes, a specific suspension tune, an electronically limited slip rear axle and its own final drive ratio, a bold Z51 spec exhaust and updated heavy duty cooling, plus grippy Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tyres that are 19 inches on the front and 20 inches on the rear. Again, this car fits 20 grand's worth of cost options, and that includes 3.5 grand's worth of forged alloy wheels and about 500 bucks worth of black detailing on the outside. But most of the costly upgrades are on the inside, so let's go check that out. When it comes to fancy overstyle cabins, the Corvette Stingray really takes some topping. And if you want to feel like Luke Skywalker piloting an X-Wing through the trenches of the Death Star, this is likely the place. So let's start with some of those costly options. You'll need an additional 11 grand for this jet black theme and these competition option seats, which are trimmed in leather and suede, which is matched with this rather unorthodox steering wheel. But these race buckets are seriously uncomfortable, despite the fact that there's a lot of electric adjustments. So they're a hard pass for me, and I reckon the standard pews will be much more comfy. Usually the Stingray's interior is a lot more colourful than this, so this car gets 6.5 grand of stealth effect, which gives you basically the blackout effect plus a lot of gloss carbon fibre in some of the detailing. Of course, the squared off wheel looks totally bonkers, but as I'm fast discovering, it does feel quite comfortable and quite natural, and you do get an unfettered view of the 12-inch configurable driver screen. And you also get these tasty large wheel-mounted paddle shifters, unlike the collar-mounted stuff that you get in some Italian supercars. But the real elephant in this cockpit is the self-indulgent, driver-centric design. It's so self-indulgent that at times I think why Chevrolet just didn't even bother dispensing with the passenger seat to begin with and just make it a single seater, because the front passenger is pretty much left out of the cold for any of the features of the cabin. Now take for example the media system. Now it's an 8-inch touchscreen and it feels very personal and it's angled straight at the driver. I don't even think the passenger could see it. But despite its small size, it's reasonably sharp, has good smartphone mirroring, excellent camera system, and it's about all you need in a bona fide supercar. At least the media system is conventional, which is more than can be said about the transmission controller, the drive mode select, and the HVAC controls. So when it comes to transmission control, it's all levers and buttons and it's very unorthodox. Now, I think what they were going for was a bit of a jet fighter effect, but given I've never flown one, I wouldn't know. Stranger still is the drive mode selection dial, which is actually hidden under a tiny little codpiece. But above it, you do get a fairly handy button for the 40mm front lift system, which can lift the nose in 3 seconds, which is pretty cool. What really tops the weird cake is the HVAC controls, which are arranged on a line across what I can only call a fence between the driver and the passenger. Now the novelty factor might be through the roof, but I do think it's quite weird that if you're driving along and you want to adjust the temperature, you have to look under your left armpit. But all in all, it drips with supercar vibes. Of course, you sit very, very low, which raises the bonnet up in your eye line, and the roof is slung down, almost touching your hair. It's all good for bona fide supercar vibes, and in fact, you can actually pop the top of the coupe roof off, which saves you 15 grand from having to buy the convertible version. So the roof detaches via 3 levers, 1 lever in the rear and 2 levers up the front. And you have to physically remove it, but it can be stowed under the clamshell in the rear in the surrogate boot section. Elsewhere, the 3LT spec gets lashings of leather over the dash fascias to give it a bit more of an upmarket feel. And of course, with a 2-seater coupe like this, you get lots of little hidden cubbies, such as the inductive phone pad that sits right behind your rear elbow. Storage is at a premium, though it has a reasonably handy boot, so let's go check that out. When you're not stowing the roof panel in the boot section, there's actually quite a lot of room in here for a few soft bags or even the week's groceries, though I don't know how you're going to go putting the ice cream next to the hot engine bay. You also get a pretty decent front that's nice and deep and can load all sorts of objects. And when you add the front and the rear stowage together, it's 356 litres, which is about the size of a small hatchback. Also quite cool is both the front and the rear lids are soft closing. With all of that covered off, it's about time we hit the blacktop. After a short, sharp bark into life, the Corvette settles down into a very mild manner indeed. The engine might be perched behind your ears, but it purrs along like a kitten, and the whole experience at a cruise is really surprisingly serene. It's certainly not as hardwired and as highly strung as a car with this much on-tap performance. That continues through the steering, which is really direct and has brilliant communication, but around town it's very, very light. The same goes for the ride and handling balance. Now, there's a certain rigidity to the all-aluminium construction, and there's certainly a lot of rubber footprint on the ground, but the compliance from the dampers is really nothing short of sublime for this kind of car. This is really where the Americana comes out in this particular supercar. The American market is really one who enjoys cruising the boulevard as much as it does taking to a racetrack or a twisty mountain road. And the Corvette settles into that cruiser role really well indeed. Some of that character extends through to the powertrain. Now the big V8 is actually quite soft, rounded and doughy when you're around town or you're at a cruise, so there's nothing too peaky or edgy about it. For the most part, the dual clutch transmission is a polite shifter when you're on the move. Though around town it can be caught jolting a little bit between gear changes, particularly at low speed. But it still feels like a genuine bona fide sports car. Now, there's a few knocks from the suspension and a couple of creaks here and there just to remind you that there's still plenty of character and mojo about this vehicle. Now, what's really clear is that this Corvette is wide and takes up a lot of real estate, so you do have to be careful, particularly around town, about curbing those forged wheels or slapping its wing mirrors against parked traffic. And the rear visibility is less than stellar, but thankfully, it's got a pretty decent reversing camera. When it comes to taking on that Jekyll role, it really is about as easy to live with as you could possibly imagine for a car of this magnitude. But serious fire and brimstone really is only a prod of the right foot away. There are 6 drive modes to choose from, and in the fairly lazy tour mode, it's hardly what you would call urgent in responses. But with a twist of the dial, you can activate sport mode and it really starts to flex its muscles. In sport, it gets louder, bolder, and noticeably more urgent, but without feeling unhinged or completely losing its manners. But while it's clearly amped up, it still remains a very progressive performer. Find some corners and push on, and the Corvette really amps up the engagement with the driver. I've heard criticisms of the steering, particularly about the weight, but for me, it remains crisp and clear, and that is ultimately the most important thing with the direction finder. With a 40% front and a 60% rear weight bias, the nose tends to push on a little bit first when you start digging into the corners. But all's required is just the slightest lift to regain grip and tidy up the front end and your line. In terms of balance, it just really is super cooperative. It really is a chassis that inspires confidence and encourages you to push on. Nothing weird, nothing spooky. And like a true thoroughbred, it tends to encourage the driver rather than intimidate. Dial it up to its ultimate Z or Z mode, and its responses really become quite rifle bolt. And if you are tempted to start messing about with a multi-mode traction control, the chassis really does start to come alive. Engine, transmission, steering, brake feel, it's all customizable as well. But even left in its set and forget sport mode, it's wickedly quick point to point across a back road if you're trying to keep those sticky rear Michelin 305mm tyres nice and tidy. Track mode, of course, is left for its namesake, at least for dry days than what we've got today. But there are certainly more than enough signs on road that when you do let the Corvette hang its tail out on track, it's absolutely and fully capable to do so. Frankly, I wasn't expecting to warm to the Corvette Stingray nearly as much as I have. We raved about it 2 years ago, and I'm going to rave about it now. But what we haven't covered off is what's new for 2024. So you now get a choice of 4 new colours, 2 new wheel designs, some adjustments to the aero styling, and the nice soft closing effect for the front. There's also a host of new safety features to bring it up with the times, and that includes some pedestrian detection and forward collision warning for the AEB, active lane keeping and lane departure warning, and some smarter technology with the headlights. It's worth a shout too that we've seen around 11 litres per 100 for the combined cycle and around 13 litres around town, which isn't too bad for a supercar with this level of performance. Less impressive though is the 3-year 100,000 kilometre warranty, which isn't a lot of surety for your $200,000 investment. Alternatives? Well, with Porsche's Cayman on chopping blocks and Audi's R8 now defunct, there aren't a lot of other alternatives out there for mid-engine supercar experiences with internal combustion for similar money. There are other alternatives in Porsche 911 and McLaren's menu, but you will need to spend well north of $300,000 for this level of performance. Yes, a hotter Z06 version and the hybrid electric E-Ray will bolster the Aussie Corvette lineup soon enough, which will make this Stingray the slowest Corvette in the current lineup. But that shouldn't detract from the virtues that's on offer here with the regular Stingray version. The C8 Stingray is lots of fun, super fast, easy to live with, and oozes lots of charisma. It has supercar presence and does command a lot of attention when you're driving it around. Better yet, it's such a rare bird that it doesn't really have the kind of stigma that is associated with Lamborghinis, Porsche 911s and Ferraris. So that's what I think, but how about you? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe while you're at it, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.